I am going to play this game instead. Okay. And we're back. This game has volume controls, so I can actually play it while talking. So I'm gonna start over because I didn't really get that far anyway. But so I'm gonna be talking about philosopher Teresa Brennan. She came from the feminist field of philosophy, but she also, even more so, came from the psychoanalytic field of philosophy. And really bridging the gap between those, she popularized what is known as affect theory, which is a theory that came out of, I would say, feminist and queer theory more so than any other, really. But before I get into what affect theory is, I want to talk a little bit about Teresa Brennan, the person. So she was an Australian woman. She was very spiritual. She was said to be a very outgoing, fun-loving person, a little bit wild, but in a good way, not a frightening way. But she decided that she wanted to come to Florida because she apparently, reportedly, was tired of hearing people saying that you couldn't have good ideas in the heat. And I don't know, I've lived in Florida my entire life, and I think it's a little bit hard to think in the heat, but she wanted to prove people wrong, so she ended up coming to Florida Atlantic University, which is actually where I got my bachelor's and my MA degree. And I was introduced to her work pretty much because I had gone to Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton. My mentor at that school was Dr. Lauren Gilmet, and she works a lot on Teresa Brennan, and she introduced me to her work. And Teresa Brennan's work, specifically her book Transmission of Affect, is what I based most of my thesis on, and I'll get into that later. But Teresa Brennan, she lived in the Coral Springs area, which is South Florida, Broward County. I don't know a lot about her personal life other than what I've heard. She was friends with a lot of the more mystical, I guess, spiritual people in the area. She was also friends with Dr. Jane Caputi, who was another FAU professor. She's still there. I took a couple classes with her. She's brilliant and wonderful, and I'll probably do another episode on some of her work, actually. But, so yeah, but she wasn't really liked by everyone. I'm not getting that because that's a thing, and I could get into trouble. But she was, and she was very intelligent, and that came across in a lot of what she would say. And became the Dr. Ram public hold. Now the nephew. She pretty much started on her own. And unfortunately, she ended up passing away at the age of 51 because of a hit-and-run accident. She was actually only 50 when she was hit, and she was in a coma for a very long time, and there was some contention about whether or not they should keep her on life support, and this actually had to do with a lot of her spiritual beliefs in her life, reportedly, that she was going to die at the age of 50, and that she knew that. And she would have had they taken her off life support sooner. But one of her friends said that she had had a dream about her and that she wasn't ready to go yet, and that they should keep her on longer. And they didn't really want to do that, but they also knew that Teresa Brennan was a very spiritual person, and maybe that could be, and all this. So they kept her on a little bit longer, but she ended up dying at age 51. This was around 2004, I believe. So she's been gone for a couple years, but her influence is still, well, how should I put this? A lot of the reason that Teresa Brennan is not well known is because of her spirituality, I would say. A lot of people wrote her theories off as being too pseudoscience-y, very mystical, not really grounded in facts the way that they want it to be, which I don't agree with. I think a lot of people who have actually read her work would say that it's not like that at all. She actually does try and incorporate science as much as possible when she's talking about her theories. But it did keep her out of the mainstream for a very long time. It's only really now that people are starting to take her seriously again. And I would actually credit Dr. Guillemette and many of the people she's worked with for that. So I'll talk about affect theory now then. So affect theory was not Teresa Brennan's idea specifically, but she did write The Transmission of Affect, which I mentioned earlier, and that book talks about it at length. And so basically what affect theory is, when it comes out of the psychological tradition, affects are basically like emotions. And so it's like how you pick up on the emotions of other people. So like when we talk about like somebody having a flat affect, we're talking about them not showing a facial expression for whatever emotion it is. They're just flat. So affect theory is like, how do we understand those things? How do we pick up on other people's emotions? How do we understand affects within us? An early essay by Teresa Brennan, the name of which escapes me now, but I will link it in the description later when I upload this to YouTube. She talks about how she experiences affects as things that pass through us, how we used to call them like passions, and we used to understand our passions as like overtaking us and moving us in certain ways, and they would go away to this. So the transmission of affect is more so about like how people admit. Her argument here is based on the idea of like pheromones and understanding each other's things like and energy. Energy is a big one. The energetic transmission of affect. She had a better term for it that I'll have to look up too, but a lot of her book is basically about affect in groups and how like this can turn into like mob mentalities and things like that, how we pick up on how each other are feeling through these non-verbal ways. In that book, I ended up doing a lot of my research on. I'll talk about my thesis in a minute, but I want to get some of the groundwork in here. Let's see. I'm going to have to do a whole episode on the transmission of affect, but I'll give a brief because I have my copy marked up a lot. But she says affects are different from feelings because feelings are more how we interpret affects. Like we feel like we have a sensation and we would call that a feeling, or how we understand that sensation is what we would call a feeling, but the sensation itself is affect. For instance, like if you get this like surge of like energy and it's in response to something that upsets you, you might interpret that as anger, but that like surge of energy is the affect that we then interpret. And she says we do this through the process of discernment. We have to understand what it is, like what that we're having a sensation to begin with, and like based on things like experience and what we understand of the situation we're reacting to is how we discern what the feeling is. And that's a big crux of this book. She also, I didn't really want to talk about this, but I think it's really interesting, and I think it would be a disservice not to when talking about Teresa Brennan's life. So, there's I guess we can call it a conspiracy around her death, where, shortly before she died, a book had come out that she had written called Globalization and Its Terrors, and it came out in 2002, and it was about the terrorist attacks in 2001, like 9/11 and all that, And it was about, like, why would another country basically want to do this to us? What is it about us that is making other people so angry? And, like, it's a really interesting book. I unfortunately don't have a copy of it personally because it's hard to get a hold of because it's so controversial and expensive. But, it's really interesting, but it came out at a time when patriotism and nationalism especially was really high in the US, and, like, she was Australian. People were really skeptical of her opinions on any of this. And there are rumors that the hit and run was not entirely an accident because of this. We don't know. We'll never know. They have no idea who hit her, and we, at this point, like, it's been many years, we're not going to know. And even my mentor warned of, like, getting too involved in this. It's really not helpful to, like, try and crack this mystery at this point. It just is what it is, unfortunately. But that is something to note about who, like, I think it's important to show, like, who she is as a person. She's really not afraid of talking about things that are controversial, and I think that's another contributing factor to why people did not want to take her very seriously when it came to any of her ideas, really. Let's see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about affects and how her work influenced my work. So I did my master's in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and I used her mostly transmission of affect, but also she has a book called Exhausting Modernity that I used quite a bit. And I wrote my thesis on that, and it was, it's called Rethinking Affect Through Social Justice, Teresa Brennan, Energetics, and Living Attention. So it's a long title, but in academia, that's kind of you need titles, subtitles, it's gotta be long to sound serious, and all that. And I mostly wrote about how taking affect theory seriously is beneficial for thinking about social justice. And I argued that Teresa Brennan's transmission of affect is especially important for that, because we need to understand how our affects affect other people and how we understand our own. So I'm going to briefly go over my achiever in my most of it. So my will link because it's like and my but it's roughly 50 pages about the sum of each section. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, there's 5. You'd think I'd remember that, but you know, it's been a minute since I've been in grad school. Actually, I'm only going to be talking about 4 because my first section is basically on why I wanted about Teresa specifically, and I think I've covered that. I think it's very interesting. Third thing is that they didn't really take her, and this is knowledge being rules here. On the feminist doesn't call her she does thinker. She's written like 2, but she also briefly mentions she doesn't insert affect in groups. Not true, because she has a whole chapter in the transmission, and arguably the whole book is about groups. Because of that, people ended up reading that in some very popular book, and not reading Teresa Brennan, and not feeling the need to generate. It's another thing. Which is really unfortunate, because Sarah Ahmed's really smart, too. She's got some amazing things to say. I don't agree with her on everything, obviously, but she's a lot of influenced by her, too, especially The Promise of Happiness and the Cultural Politics of Emotion. She can be another episode thing, too, but I am going to move on and talk about the main argument of my thesis, which is that I am talking, other than just saying that, you know, emotions are important for social justice, basically. The way that we do this, I think, this was interesting to me. I don't know if it'd be interesting to anybody else. I was arguing that through empathy is how we would, or like cultivating empathy within ourselves and each other is how we would take that step into taking affect theory seriously and the emotions of others seriously. But the more I thought about how to phrase that and stuff, I kept running into like the idea of emotional intelligence, and that rubbed me the wrong way, and I couldn't figure out why. And the more I thought about it, and the more I heard other people talk about it, it's like emotional intelligence has been, that expression and like what it sort of used to mean has been very commodified by like the business world, and it's come to mean some like a way for like corporations to manipulate you, basically. Like, they pretend to have feelings, or like they manipulate your, like, they understand people's emotions to the extent that they can use them for their own gain, and like they call that emotional intelligence, which is what I would argue is not emotional intelligence. But it's something a little more to me, but you know, capitalism. But another thing is that the phrase emotional intelligence, or EQ, comes from the idea of intelligence quotient, IQ, which I also have a problem with, because that, like, IQ is based on like a lot of eugenics-y sort of things. It's very like it's like it's racist, it's classist, it's just like, it's a bad concept, and I wish the idea of IQ would go away too. But because of that, I didn't want to use the idea of emotional intelligence or EQ or any of that, because I didn't really want those associations. It felt like it was betraying what I was trying to get across. It made it sound very clinical, which is like, I'm talking about feelings, I can't talk about them like they're just a bunch of numbers and data. It felt very talking about Brennan's work specifically, but you know, we move on. So I instead turned to Brennan's idea of living attention instead when I started talking about empathy. And basically what living attention is it's like being more conscious of other people's feeling. Like, it's making a very conscious effort to read people, and cultivating this desire to understand them by understanding their emotions. It's like, it's very easy for us to get caught up in our own feelings and whatever we're doing in any given day. I know I'm guilty of that a lot. Cultivating living attention would be more just like trying to bring your, I guess people might call this mindfulness. I don't think they're exactly the same thing, because mindfulness, I think, is about you being in the moment, whereas living attention is about paying attention to other people in the moment more. And just trying to like, and it can be verbal too. I know I emphasized nonverbal affect transmission before. It can involve verbal transmission as well. Like, just asking people how they are, why they feel that way, and like taking a genuine interest in people. And like emphasizing that it's important to do that. And my whole last chapter is on that, so I will save the rest of that for later. But my first actual chapter, when I get into the meat of what I'm talking about, is about humor and grief in political activism. And this I had written right after Trump got elected, and I still stand by it, actually, because my argument in this is that people right before the election greatly misused humor, like specifically stand-up comedians, and like oh, memes a lot, but there was also like a lot of the like what is that genre called, like comedic, like The Daily Show, The Nightly Show, The Tonight Show. They didn't take him serious. They didn't take Trump seriously enough to a punchline, and I think that actually did way more harm than good. Because people talk about, like, oh, you need to laugh to get through it, but, like, sometimes when you do that, you fail to take things as seriously as you need to. And I would argue that is what happened in the 2016 election. People thought Trump was this nonsensical, like, could never happen in a million years candidate. As a threat, he became one, because we didn't stop him. And we can talk about the rigged elections and how Hillary won the popular vote and all that stuff, too, but really, it's not... to like, this could have been avoided, I think, if we had like been more vocal about like Trump is dangerous and like it's easy to make fun of him, but like we need to understand that he's actually still causing harm to people. Because obviously he has. We know that now. But I would say that, like, more of this could have been avoided. If we'd not just been, like, writing him off and making memes about him for however long the election cycle and all that lasted. And, like, humor can be done in a really subversive way, but I don't think it was, like, and it's done a lot to, like, challenge people's opinions, but for like, throughout history for other things, but I think it was greatly misused around this time, and comedians get really defensive when you talk about that, but, you know, and, like, not everything can be a joke, and it sucks. Like, I wish we could just do that all the time, but it, like, humor's a coping mechanism, I get it, but, like, when you use humor to the extent where you can't understand the threat in front of you, like, that's a problem. And I argue that, like, the way to cope with this... Well, I'd go on a long tangent about Hannah Gatsby's Nanette, because she talks about, like, the problems here with, like, treating laughter as the best medicine. And she says that she doesn't believe that laughter's good for you, but, you know, sometimes you need tension. Like, and, like, relieving that tension feels good, but, like, you have to sit in it. Well, she goes on later about that, but, like, she forces her audience to sit with tension at the end of her special, because she wants them to understand the trauma. I think that's a really poignant way of expressing this idea. She actually came out with that special after I had started writing this, and once it came out, I was like, oh, this is perfect. I was having a moment. Like, so, like, as an academic, sometimes something like that happens when you're working on something and you just find the perfect, like, example or perfect evidence for what you're talking about. It's euphoric. That's why I'm in academia. But, so, Hannah Gatsby had a big influence on that paper too, but that was the, like, the beginning argument of that essay. And the second half was talking about how I think grief is actually a better political tool when we're trying to understand bad things that are happening. So, like, I talk about this a little bit. Historically, well, where should I start with this? Instead of joking about that are bad, which is, I think, the impulse, because it feels good. People, you know, they bond through laughter and things like that, but there are other ways to do that even though they don't feel good, can be way more cathartic and much healthier when dealing with serious problems. And I, like I said, argue that grief is that thing. The first example that I talk about is how during the AIDS crisis, when nobody wanted to take it serious, well, no political person wanted to take it seriously, the things that eventually ended up working in their favor and, like, had public displays of grief. Like, activists had public displays of grief. They had die-ins, they had the quilt, they had all sorts of, like, memorials and things like that saying, like, hey, people are dying, and people we care about are dying. Oh god, my dog. People we love are, like, not alive anymore, and you need to do something about it. That sort of thing. Because of what's going on. And I would argue the more modern example of that now, because the AIDS crisis wasn't that long ago, Black Lives Matter, like, unfortunately, that hasn't caused as much change as we would like. Especially recently, we have people going out and publicly, like, Black people have been murdered for no reason. And I think the movement has gained a lot. You don't, like, that you wouldn't joke about it. I hope you wouldn't. And, like, grief in this case is way more powerful for that reason. Yeah, I think, like, people now like, Black Lives Matter has gained significant traction in the past couple of years, I think, because of grief specifically. And, like, the not just people of color, like black people, but like white people understanding like human beings, and they need to be respected, and their lives need to be taken seriously and respected. And like, not white people, not this action politically, we gotta make politicians and other people understand like people are being hurt, should care. And, like, I don't think you can really do that with jokes in the same way. And, like, maybe you can. I have not heard a joke that has pulled it off yet. I don't know. Maybe there's just a lot of bad comedians out there. That's also highly possible. But I have yet to see really most... Like, I've seen... Hannah Gatsby is a good example. Tig Notaro. Very small amounts of you females who are able to talk about this stuff. Patton Oswalt did a really good job of shortly after his wife died, and you like, that's another story, but like there are a handful of comedians I think who can pull this off, but for the most part that's irresponsible. I think if you like ordinary people, like people who aren't dead, things that they have no business finding humor about, really should just stay away from that, I think. And that's, I think, most people. Even most comedians. Because TBH, a lot of them aren't great. But there are some that I like. But for the most part, a lot of them are bad. But that's another discussion for another day. So yeah, that was chapter 1. And that was the first chapter of my thesis. My first actual chapter. I went through the whole thing today because I don't want to keep y'all here all night, but I will maybe do a part 2 next week. Let's see. I will talk about two of my thesis next week, but I will end on saying that Teresa Brennan is that people are working on her stuff now, and that's great. My mentor actually took a essay of hers called The Lost Myth of the Atheism and did illustrations for it and published it in these books. There are only like 5 copies in the world. I have one. And I have some of the original artwork that went into the book. Not to brag, but I'm bragging. And this book was really interesting. It's all spirituality, basically. It's Teresa Brennan. I believe she was queer. She had a lot of queer friends, even if she wasn't. I can't quite remember. I believe she was. But, she wanted a different sort of baptismal ritual for her queer friends that wasn't necessarily tied to, like, Christianity or, like, any of that. So she writes this whole myth about, like, how human beings came from the water originally and the things, and the reason we cry is because we want to return to the ocean, like that's why tears are salty, that sort of thing. And it's a really beautiful myth. I will probably, if I can find a link to the article on, or the shorter version online, I will put a link to that. Because it's a really beautiful thing. It's philosophically interesting, but not immediately relevant to affect theory, but I think it's worth checking out. It's just a really interesting thing to read, and basically the story, there's like a lot of discussion of sin and like what that means and inertia. So the myth is basically that there was, before anything, there were just waves in the water. And there was one wave who decided to stop moving. And this decision to stop moving, this inertia, is basically like this version of like original sin. And I would love to talk about more, but I don't think that's going to make sense to other people who have not read this. So I'm going to leave it here for now. I hope you all enjoyed this and enjoy further reading if you so choose. Yeah, this is one of my most passionate projects for me. So more on this another night. Thank you.